He wasn't supposed to react like that. Not here. Not to her. The desert air at the southern border hung still and dry, the kind of quiet that settled into your lungs and stayed there, tasting faintly of dust and engine oil. A line of vehicles stretched beneath the dim floodlights, headlights cutting pale tunnels through the night as agents moved with practiced rhythm, checking documents, waving people through, keeping everything moving. It was routine. It was always routine until it wasn't. Agent Daniel Hayes stood just off the inspection lane, arms crossed, eyes scanning without urgency, a man shaped by years of trusting patterns more than people. Beside him, Rex, a 5-year-old German shepherd with a sable coat and steady amber eyes, moved with quiet precision, nose low, reading the world in ways no human ever could. Rex didn't rush. He didn't bark without reason. Every movement meant something. That was why Hayes trusted him more than most men he'd served with. The next vehicle rolled forward slowly, an aging sedan with faded paint and out-of-state plates, its engine idling unevenly like it had driven too many miles without rest. Behind the wheel sat a woman, mid-30s, maybe, her hands tight around the steering wheel, knuckles pale, shoulders drawn inward as if bracing against something unseen. In the back seat, a small child lay curled beneath a thin blanket, still quiet, almost too quiet. "Evening, ma'am," Hayes called, voice calm measured. The woman nodded, offering documents with a trembling hand. "Emily Carter," he read softly, eyes flicking up just long enough to meet hers. Tired eyes, not suspicious, just tired. Everything about her looked ordinary. That was the problem. Rex approached the vehicle without command, his pace slowing as he neared the driver's side door. No sudden movements. No alert posture. Just a subtle shift. His ears tilting forward, his breathing changing, his focus narrowing into something sharp and invisible. Hayes noticed immediately. He always did. "Rex," he murmured under his breath, a quiet question more than a command. The dog didn't respond. Instead, he stopped completely beside the door, nose lifting slightly as if catching something carried on the air. He didn't bark. He didn't paw. He just stood there, still as stone, eyes fixed, not on the woman, not on the bags in the passenger seat, but somewhere deeper, somewhere unseen. The line behind the car grew restless. Another agent gestured impatiently from a few yards away. "You good, Hayes?" Hayes didn't answer right away. His gaze stayed on Rex, on the stillness, on the way the dog's chest rose just a little slower than usual, like he was listening instead of breathing. That wasn't part of any training manual. Emily shifted in her seat. Is something wrong?" she asked softly, her voice barely carrying over the hum of engines. Hayes stepped closer, resting one hand lightly on the frame of the car, his eyes moving from her face to the back seat, then back again. Nothing obvious. No signs of distress. No visible threat. Just a mother and her child trying to cross a line on a map. And yet, Rex didn't move. The desert wind brushed faintly against Hayes's jacket, carrying with it a scent too subtle for him to name. But Rex knew. He always knew. Hayes exhaled slowly, the weight of a decision forming in the quiet space between instinct and protocol. Because Rex wasn't trained to react without reason. And right now, he wasn't reacting. He was warning. Hayes had learned a long time ago that the most dangerous moments were not the loud ones, not the ones filled with alarms or raised voices, but the quiet ones where something felt just slightly out of place, like a note in a song that did not belong yet refused to be ignored. And right now, everything about Rex said this was one of those moments, because the dog was not showing aggression, not signaling detection in the way he had been trained. He was simply refusing to let go of something. Invisible, something that existed just beyond human reach. And that was what unsettled Hayes the most. He shifted his weight and leaned a little closer to the open window, his voice calm but firmer now. "Ma'am, I need you to step out of the vehicle for a moment." Emily hesitated, her fingers tightening around the steering wheel before slowly releasing it, the faint creak of leather loud in the still night. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice carrying a fragile steadiness, the kind that people use when they're trying not to let fear take over. Hayes shook his head slightly, Just a routine check. Nothing to worry about. It was not entirely a lie, but it was not the truth either, because routine did not feel like this. Routine did not make a trained K9 stand perfectly still like he was listening to something no one else could hear. Emily nodded and opened the door, stepping out into the dry desert air, her shoes crunching softly against the gravel as she moved to the side of the car. Hayes noticed the way she glanced back at the rear seat. Just for a second, quick but deliberate, like a silent check to make sure something was still there, or perhaps to make sure something was not noticed. Rex followed that glance, his head turning slightly, his focus shifting for the first time, not toward the luggage, not toward the woman, but toward the child in the back seat. And then he did something even more unusual. He stepped away from the driver's side and circled the vehicle slowly, his nose tracing the air rather than the metal, as if the scent he was following was not attached to the car at all, but to something inside it, something breathing, something alive. Hayes felt a quiet tension settle into his chest, not panic, not urgency, just a growing awareness that this was no longer about checking documents or scanning for contraband. This was something else entirely. Behind him, another agent approached, lowering his voice. "We are backing up traffic. Hayes, you got something or not?" Hayes kept his eyes on Rex, watching the way the dog paused by the rear door, his body language still controlled but unmistakably focused. "Give me a minute," he replied, his tone leaving little room for argument. The other agent exhaled but stepped back, trusting Hayes enough not to interfere. Emily stood a few feet away now, arms wrapped loosely around herself, the desert night brushing cool against her skin. "My son is sleeping," she said quietly, almost as if offering reassurance. "He has been sick. We have been driving all day." Hayes looked at her then, really looked, noticing the exhaustion in her posture, the faint tremor in her voice, the way her eyes flickered between him and the car, not with guilt, but with something heavier, something closer to fear mixed with hope, the kind of look people carry when they're holding on to the last fragile piece of something that matters. Rex let out a low, soft whine, barely audible, the kind that did not signal threat but concern. And that was when Hayes understood that this was not a detection. It was a warning of a different kind, the kind no training manual could fully explain, and suddenly the routine of the checkpoint felt very far away, replaced by a single quiet question that pressed against his thoughts with growing weight. What exactly was Rex trying to tell him? Hayes had heard that sound before, not often, but enough to know it mattered, a low, restrained whine that did not belong to training exercises or control detections. It was something deeper, something instinctive, and Rex only made that sound when he was not just identifying something, but feeling it. And that difference changed everything. Hayes stepped toward the rear door, slow and deliberate, his hand hovering just above the handle as he glanced back at Emily. "How old is your son?" he asked quietly, not because he needed the information for a report, but because he needed to hear her answer, to measure the space between her words and the truth. "He is 6, she replied, her voice soft, almost protective. "His name is Noah." Hayes nodded once, then opened the rear door carefully, the hinges creaking faintly as the interior of the car revealed itself under the overhead light. The child lay curled on his side beneath a thin blanket, his small frame still, his breathing shallow but steady, his face partially hidden by the edge of the fabric. There were no visible signs of distress, nothing obvious, nothing that would trigger alarm in a routine inspection. And yet Rex moved closer immediately, his posture lowering, his nose drawing in slow, deliberate breaths, not searching now, but confirming. Hayes crouched slightly, his eyes narrowing as he studied the boy more closely. Something about the stillness felt off. Not wrong in a way he could explain, just not right in a way he could not ignore. "Noah," he said gently, his voice softer now. "Hey, buddy." There was no response, not even a stir. Emily stepped closer, her voice quick but controlled. "He is just sleeping. He has had a long day. He gets like that when he is tired." Hayes did not look at her this time. His focus remained on the child, on the rise and fall of his chest, on the faint sheen of sweat along his forehead despite the cool night air. Rex let out another soft sound, this time pressing his nose closer, not touching, just hovering, as if the space itself carried meaning. Hayes felt that same quiet pressure building again, the kind that did not come from evidence but from experience, from moments where something small did not fit, and refusing to ignore it meant the difference between walking away and uncovering something that mattered. Behind him, the other agent called out again, louder this time, "Hayes, we need to move." The line of cars had grown longer, headlights stretching back into the dark like a river of impatience. Hayes exhaled slowly, then made a decision that was not about procedure, but about trust. "We're doing a secondary check," he said firmly, standing up and closing the rear door with care. Emily's expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough for Hayes to see it. A flicker of something that could have been fear or relief or both tangled together. "Is that necessary?" she asked, her voice quieter now, almost pleading but not resisting. Hayes met her eyes for a brief moment, steady and calm. "Yes, ma'am. It is," he signaled to another agent, who approached with a nod, already preparing to guide the vehicle toward the inspection area. Rex stayed close, his body aligned with the car, as if he had chosen a side and would not leave it. And as Hayes watched the scene unfold, the noise of the checkpoint faded into the background, replaced by a single thought that settled heavy and certain in his mind. Whatever Rex had sensed was not something that could be waved through. Not tonight. Not this time, because sometimes the difference between a routine stop and a life-changing moment came down to whether someone chose to listen when nothing obvious was being said. The secondary inspection area sat just beyond the main flow of traffic, a quiet pocket carved out of routine, where time seemed to slow and every detail carried more weight. The overhead lights hummed softly, casting a pale glow over the concrete as the sedan rolled to a stop, its engine cutting off with a tired shudder. Hayes stepped forward, motioning Emily to remain where she was. "Please stay by the vehicle," he said, his tone calm but firm. She nodded, though her arms tightened around herself again as if the night had suddenly grown colder. Rex did not wait for instruction this time. He moved straight to the rear of the car, circling once before stopping again at the back door, his focus unwavering. Hayes exchanged a brief glance with the assisting agent, who had already begun a standard check of the trunk and luggage. Bags were opened, items laid out, clothes, a few toys, a small cooler. Nothing unusual, nothing that would justify the tension hanging in the air. Clear so far. The agent muttered, though his voice carried a hint of uncertainty now, as if he too could feel that something was not lining up. Hayes nodded but did not respond. His attention remained on Rex, who had not shifted position, not even an inch, the dog's breathing steady, controlled, but his eyes locked on the same point. The same invisible thread he had been following since the first moment. "Rex," Hayes said softly, stepping closer. The dog flicked an ear, but did not break focus, and that was enough. Hayes reached for the rear door again, slower this time, more deliberate, as if opening it would reveal something he was not fully prepared to face. The door swung open, and the quiet inside the car pressed outward. The child still lay in the same position, unmoving, the blanket slightly askew now. Hayes leaned in, closer than before, his senses sharpening. He was not looking for something obvious anymore. He was looking for something subtle, something that did not belong. And then he noticed it, not a sight, not a sound, but a pattern, the breathing. It was too shallow, too rhythmic in a way that felt off, like a metronome set, just slightly wrong. Rex shifted forward, lowering himself gently, his head aligning with the child's chest. Not touching, just close enough to feel, to listen in his own way. Another soft whine escaped him, quieter than before, almost like a question. Hayes felt a tightening in his chest, a memory flickering at the edge of his mind. A briefing years ago, a case that had slipped through because someone had trusted appearances over instinct. He swallowed that thought and focused. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice steady but carrying more weight now. "When was the last time your son saw a doctor?" There was a pause, just a fraction too long. Emily stepped forward slightly, her voice careful. "A few days ago. He just has a fever, that is all. We were told to let him rest." Hayes studied her face, searching for something beyond the words, but what he saw was not deception. It was strain, the kind that comes from holding something heavy for too long behind him. The assisting agent spoke again, quieter this time. "Everything checks out, Hayes. There's nothing here." Hayes nodded slowly, But his eyes never left the child because he knew now this was not about what was in the bags. It was not about documents or hidden compartments. It was about something far more fragile, something that could not be declared or detected by standard means. Rex remained still, his presence steady, unwavering, as if anchoring the moment, and Hayes realized that whatever Rex had sensed from the very beginning, it was not something to be dismissed or explained away. It was something that required a different kind of attention, the kind that did not come from training alone, but from the willingness to see beyond what was expected. And in that quiet, under the hum of the lights and the distant murmur of waiting engines, Hayes made another decision, one that would take this moment even further from routine, because sometimes doing the right thing meant stepping outside the lines drawn for you and trusting that what you felt mattered just as much as what you could prove. Hayes straightened slowly, the weight of uncertainty settling deeper into his chest, not sharp, not urgent, but steady and persistent, the kind that did not fade with logic or routine checks. He turned slightly toward the assisting agent, lowering his voice just enough to keep it contained. "Call medical support. Have them stand by." The agent blinked once, surprised. "Medical? Hayes, there's no sign of—" Hayes cut him off gently but firmly. "Just call it in." There was something in his tone that ended the conversation. Not authority alone, but conviction, the kind that came from experience you could not easily explain. The agent hesitated for half a second, then nodded and stepped away, reaching for his radio. Emily's eyes followed the exchange, her breathing quickening just slightly. "Is something wrong with my son?" she asked, the question hanging in the air, heavier than anything that had come before. Hayes stepped toward her, his expression steady, measured. "I do not know yet," he answered honestly, "but I want to make sure he is okay." Emily swallowed, her gaze drifting toward the car, toward the back seat where her child still lay motionless beneath the thin blanket. "He is just tired," she said again, softer now, as if repeating it might make it true. Rex shifted his weight and slowly sat down beside the open door, his posture calm but grounded, like a silent anchor holding the moment in place. Hayes glanced down at him, at the unwavering focus, and something in that quiet presence reinforced his decision. He reached into the car carefully, adjusting the edge of the blanket just enough to reveal more of the child's face. Noah's skin looked pale under the artificial light. Not alarming, not in a way that would trigger immediate panic, but lacking the warmth Hayes would have expected. He leaned closer, listening again, watching. The rise and fall of the small chest, the rhythm still there, but distant somehow, like it belonged to a different moment, a different place. "Noah," he said again, softer this time, his voice carrying a quiet invitation rather than a command. There was still no response, not even a flicker. Emily took a step forward, unable to hold back any longer. "Can I see him?" she asked, her voice trembling now. Hayes hesitated for a brief moment, then nodded, stepping aside just enough to give her space. Emily leaned into the car, her hand reaching out to gently touch her son's shoulder. Her fingers lingered there, as if searching for reassurance through contact alone. "He always sleeps like this when he is exhausted," she whispered, though the certainty in her voice had begun to fade. Rex watched closely, his head tilting slightly, his eyes never leaving the child, as if he was waiting, not for a reaction, but for confirmation of something only he could sense. The radio crackled softly in the background, the assisting agent's voice low as he relayed the request, the sound blending into the hum of the lights and the distant murmur of engines waiting beyond the checkpoint. Time stretched in that quiet space, each second carrying more weight than the last. Hayes felt it, the shift from routine to something else entirely, something that required more than protocol, more than surface-level checks. It required patience, attention, and the willingness to stay present even when nothing obvious demanded it. He looked at Emily again, really looked, and what he saw was not someone hiding something, but someone holding on to something fragile, something she might not fully understand herself. And in that moment, Hayes realized that whatever Rex had sensed from the very beginning was not about wrongdoing. It was about something slipping through the cracks, something easy to miss if you were only looking for the wrong things. And as the faint sound of approaching medical support began to rise in the distance, barely audible against the night. Hayes knew that the answer they were waiting for was not going to come from searching the car or questioning the mother. It was going to come from listening to the quiet signals that had been there all along, the ones most people would have ignored, but Rex never did. The distant hum grew louder. Not urgent, not frantic, but steady, the low roll of tires approaching over asphalt, carrying with it a quiet sense of arrival. Hayes did not turn to look. He kept his focus where it had been from the beginning, on the small space inside the car where something unseen had already begun to unfold. Emily remained leaned halfway into the back seat, her hand still resting gently on Noah's shoulder, as if she could anchor him there through touch alone. Her fingers moved slightly now, a soft brushing motion, a mother's instinct repeating itself even when words had started to fail. "Noah, honey," she whispered, her voice thinner than before, the confidence gone, replaced by something more fragile, more uncertain. Rex shifted just a few inches closer, lowering himself further until his body rested fully on the ground beside the open door, his head tilted upward, his nose drawing in slow, careful breaths, not searching anymore, just staying, as if presence alone mattered now. Hayes noticed a subtle change, the way the dog had moved from alertness into something quieter, something almost protective, and that shift settled deeper into him than any bark ever could. The assisting agent returned, his voice low. "Medical is 2 minutes out." Hayes nodded once, acknowledging without breaking his line of sight. Every second now seemed to stretch longer, the air thicker, the silence more deliberate. Emily pulled her hand back slightly, then reached again, this time brushing the edge of Noah's cheek, her touch lingering there, as if waiting for a response that did not come. "He usually wakes up when I do that," she said, though the words felt more like a question than a statement. Hayes stepped closer, his movements calm, deliberate. He leaned in again, closer than before, not just observing now, but listening with intention. There was something about the rhythm, the space between breaths, the way the stillness held on just a fraction too long. Not alarming, not dramatic, but enough to matter. Rex let out another quiet sound, softer than a whine, almost like a breath pushed through concern. Hayes glanced at him, and for a moment it felt like the dog was not just sensing something, but asking him to understand it, to see what could not be explained in simple terms. The faint glow of headlights washed over them as the medical vehicle approached, slowing as it entered the inspection area, its presence gentle, almost respectful of the quiet that had settled there. Emily straightened slightly, her eyes moving toward the sound, then back to her son, torn between hope and fear in a way that did not need words. "He's going to be okay, right?" she asked, barely above a whisper. Hayes did not answer right away, not because he did not want to reassure her, but because he knew this moment required honesty more than comfort. "We are going to make sure he is," he said finally, his voice steady, grounded, the kind of answer that held space for both truth and hope. The medical team stepped out, moving with calm efficiency, not rushed, not alarmed, just present. Hayes stepped back just enough to give them access, but he did not move far. Rex remained exactly where he was, unmoving, unwavering, as if his role in this moment was not finished yet, as if whatever he had sensed from the very beginning had only just begun to reveal itself. And as the professionals leaned in to assess what could not be seen at a glance, Hayes felt a quiet certainty settle into place. This had never been about catching something wrong. It had always been about noticing something right before it was too late to see it. At all, the medical team moved with quiet precision, their presence calm but purposeful, as one of them knelt beside the open door, gently reaching in to assess Noah with practiced care. A small light flicked on, casting a soft beam across the child's face, illuminating details that had been easy to miss under the dim overhead glow. Hayes watched closely, not interfering, just observing the shift as trained eyes began to see what instinct had already sensed. One of the medics leaned closer, listening, counting, watching, then glanced briefly at his partner, a subtle exchange that spoke without words. "He is responsive, but very weak," the medic said calmly, not alarmed but focused. "We need to get him checked further." Emily's breath caught, her hand instinctively moving to Noah's head, brushing his hair back with a tenderness that carried both fear and relief. "What is wrong with him?" she asked, her voice fragile now, no longer trying to hold steady. The medic did not rush the answer. We cannot say for sure. Yet, but his body is working harder than it should. We want to make sure he is safe. Hayes noticed the way Rex shifted slightly at those words, his body relaxing just a fraction, as if something had been confirmed, not solved, but understood, the kind of understanding that came not from answers but from recognition. The medic carefully lifted the edge of the blanket, checking again, then nodded to his partner. "Let us move him gently," he said, and they did, with care, with respect, with a quiet urgency that did not need to be spoken aloud. Emily stepped back, her hands trembling slightly now, not from panic, but from the release of something she had been holding inside for too long. Hayes remained close, not saying anything, just present, because sometimes presence was the only thing that mattered. As Noah was lifted onto a stretcher, his small form finally stirred, just a faint movement, a subtle shift that almost went unnoticed, but Emily saw it, and so did Hayes, her breath. Caught again, this time with something closer to hope. He moved, she whispered more to herself than anyone else. Rex stood slowly, stepping closer but stopping just short of the stretcher, his gaze steady, his ears relaxed now, the tension that had held him in place since the beginning easing into something quieter, something resolved. Hayes looked down at him, then back at the scene unfolding, and in that moment the pieces aligned. Not in a way that could be written in a report or explained, in a briefing, but in a way that made sense all the same. Rex had not been detecting something dangerous. He had been sensing something fragile, something slipping just beyond notice, something that needed attention before it became something else entirely. The stretcher was guided toward the medical vehicle, the doors opening with a soft metallic sound, the light inside warm compared to the cool desert air. Emily followed closely, her steps unsteady but determined. "Can I go with him?" she asked quickly. The medic nodded. Of course. Hayes stepped aside, giving her space, but as she passed him, she paused just for a second, her eyes meeting his, filled with something deeper than gratitude. Something quieter, more profound. "Thank you," she said softly, and Hayes did not respond with words. He simply nodded, because he knew this was not about him. Not really. As the doors closed and the vehicle prepared to move, Rex sat down again beside Hayes, his gaze following until the light disappeared into the distance. And in the quiet that followed, the checkpoint returned to its rhythm. Engines idling, voices low, movement steady. But for Hayes, something had shifted because he had just witnessed the kind of moment that never made headlines, never stood out in reports, but mattered all the same. The kind where nothing looked wrong, and yet everything depended on someone choosing to pay attention anyway. The night closed in again after the vehicle disappeared, the sound of its engine fading into the distance until it became just another echo swallowed by the desert. And for a moment, everything returned to what it had been before. The steady hum of headlights, the low murmur of radios, the quiet rhythm of a system that never really stopped. Hayes stood there longer than necessary, his eyes still fixed on the empty stretch of road where the ambulance had gone, as if part of him had not fully let go of that moment. Rex remained seated beside him, calm now, grounded, his breathing even, the tension that had once held his frame replaced by something softer, something settled, like a storm that had passed without needing to be named. Another agent approached, slower this time, his earlier impatience gone, replaced with a kind of quiet curiosity. "So what was it?" he asked, not skeptical anymore, just trying to understand. Hayes exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping briefly to Rex before lifting again toward the line of waiting cars. "Nothing you would have found in a search," he replied, his voice calm, thoughtful, the kind that carried more meaning than the words themselves. The agent frowned slightly, then nodded, not fully understanding, but choosing not to press further, because sometimes the explanation was not something that fit into a report or a checklist. The line began to move again, vehicles rolling forward one by one, drivers handing over documents, agents waving them through, routine reclaiming its place as if nothing had happened at all. But Hayes knew better. He returned to his position, his posture steady, his movements familiar, yet something in the way he watched had changed, not dramatically, not in a way anyone else would notice, just a little more attentive, a little more willing to pause when something did not feel right. Rex stood as well, stepping back in a position beside him, ready, alert, but no longer tense, just present, a quiet partner in a job that often depended on things that could not be explained out loud. The next car approached, headlights cutting through the dust, the driver's face illuminated in brief flashes of light and shadow. Hayes stepped forward, his voice returning to its measured tone. "Evening," he said, taking the documents, scanning them with practiced ease. But beneath that routine something lingered, a reminder that not every story announced itself clearly. Not every truth was hidden and obvious. Places, some lived in the smallest details, in the pauses in the silence between actions, in the way a dog refused to move when everything else said it was time to move on. He glanced down at Rex for just a moment, the dog's ears flicking slightly as if acknowledging the look, and Hayes understood then that what had happened was not an exception. It was a lesson, one that would not fade with the passing hours or the changing shifts. Because in a place defined by lines and rules and procedures, the most important thing he could carry forward was not just training, but trust in the instincts that did not speak, in the signals that did not shout, in the quiet moments that asked for attention instead of demanding it. And as the night stretched on and the border continued its endless flow of movement and passage, Hayes remained where he was, doing his job the same way he always had, and yet not the same at all, because now he knew with certainty that sometimes the difference between a routine stop and a life quietly changed was nothing more than a pause, a glance, and the willingness to listen when something unseen asked to be heard. The hours passed the way they always did at the border, measured not in minutes, but in motion, in the steady flow of headlights and quiet exchanges, in the rhythm of routine that rarely paused long enough to remember what had come before. But Hayes remembered, not as a dramatic moment, not as something that demanded recognition, but as something quieter, something that settled into the spaces between his actions. The kind of memory that did not fade because it had not been loud to begin with. It had been still, and stillness had a way of lasting longer than noise. Rex moved beside him with the same calm precision as always, nose low, senses open, reading the unseen world in a language only he truly understood. And Hayes no longer saw that as something separate from his own role, but as something connected, something shared in a way that did not need words. The early edge of morning began to creep into the sky, a faint blue pushing against the darkness, softening the harsh lines of the floodlights. The air cooling just enough to carry a different kind of quiet, one that felt less like waiting and more like release. Another shift would come soon. Another team would take over, the endless cycle continuing as it always had. But before that moment arrived, Hayes found himself pausing again, just for a second, his gaze drifting toward the road that stretched out beyond the checkpoint. The same road where the ambulance had disappeared hours earlier. He did not know what had happened after that. Not yet. There would be reports later, updates, facts written down in clean, structured lines. But those would never capture what had truly mattered, because what mattered had already happened here, in a space where nothing looked wrong. And yet something had been. Rex stepped forward slightly, then stopped, his ears tilting just a fraction, his posture alert but calm. Hayes followed the movement instinctively, his eyes scanning the next approaching vehicle. But there was no tension this time, no unease, just awareness, the kind that remained after a lesson had taken root. A moment passed, then another, and everything continued as expected. Routine holding steady, the line moving, the system working. And yet beneath it all, Hayes carried something different now. Not doubt, not hesitation, but a deeper understanding that the job was never only about what could be seen or proven. It was about what could be felt, what could be noticed in the spaces others might overlook. Rex returned to his side, their steps aligning again without effort. A partnership shaped not just by training, but by trust built in moments exactly like the one that had passed. The sky grew lighter, the horizon stretching open with a quiet promise of a new day. And with it came a sense of closure that did not need to be spoken, because some endings were not marked by final words or clear conclusions. They were marked by a shift, a small, lasting change in how the world was seen. Hayes rested a hand briefly on Rex's back. A simple gesture, steady and sure, and the dog leaned into it just slightly before stepping forward again. ready as always, and in that quiet exchange, there was something more than routine, something that could not be measured or recorded, only carried forward, a reminder that not every truth announced itself, not every danger made a sound, and not every life-changing moment looked like one at all. Sometimes it arrived in silence, in a pause, in the choice to listen when nothing obvious demanded attention. And sometimes it came through a dog who did not bark, but refused to walk away, and a man who chose to trust that stillness instead of ignore it. And because of that, somewhere beyond the border, in a place Hayes might never see, a story continued that otherwise might have ended before anyone realized it had begun.